Okay, welcome everyone. We're so glad you're here. We're just waiting for a couple more people to get admitted and get their audio set up, and then we'll get started. Hi, Mia, welcome. All right, well, it's great to see everyone. My name is Julie Stigmeyer. I work in GSEP writing support, and we'll be sharing a presentation with you today about how to refine your writing to add more professionalism and credibility by integrating research well. So we're going to get started on our presentation shortly. I wondered if Gina and Carlos, you might introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Carlos Jimenez. I'm the manager of writing support services here at GSEP. Also a graduate of GSEP in the master's on the education side, master's TESOL, so teaching English to speakers of other languages. I'm going on my 10th year here at GSEP. Just real excited to start the spring off with our first webinar series. So thank you.
And hi, everyone. I'm Gina Meister, and I'm the Associate Director of Writing Support, and I'm so glad that you've joined us today. We're really excited about this webinar. So, and we'll be watching the chat, Carlos and I, so feel free to ask questions as we go along. We will be responding. And feel free to put your videos on if you would like. That's it for now. Welcome.
Thank you, Gina and Carlos. Great to be with you all today, and we're going to get started now talking about our topic. I have some information in the chat for you. Just a link to our GSEP writing support page so that if you are not as familiar with our services, you can check that out and see some of the other resources we have. And then also I created a folder for today's session to talk about with all of the documents that I'll be sharing, so you can access that. So let's get started. Let's see. All right, gonna try to.
Just a reminder to everyone, we'll be recording the session today, and we'll be sharing the recording, so you'll all be able to go back and review it. Likely within the next day or so.
Thank you, Carlos. Yeah, so we're going to work by talking about a little bit of the differences between undergraduate and graduate level writing, really to add helpful credibility and sophistication to your writing. We're going to go through this by first of all, comparing the expectations. So you could kind of see what may have been required of you in the past and now what may be required of you now. We'll talk about some terms, and then we're going to take some time a little bit later to get into breakout rooms and try to apply what we're sharing in our session today. So first, I'm just going to go through some expectations of undergraduate and graduate writing. So as I was thinking about these sort of standards that are typical of undergraduate versus graduate, it reminded me of some of my past teaching, which was with undergraduates in composition classes. And I know Gina has taught composition as well, and Carlos has worked with TESOL students. So we kind of know what is done at different levels. And so I was just thinking about that one day, and I thought it might be helpful to define and identify some of those differences. So one of the things the first one relates to the topic. So students search for, interpret, and understand data broadly at the undergraduate level, and view popular, trade, or non-peer-reviewed sources quite often. And I'll kind of define some of those in a moment. Whereas with graduate students, you are looking very specifically at a chosen discipline. So whatever your sphere is, education or psychology, you are really working to add to that body of knowledge and understand that. And then you're all familiar, I'm sure, with what peer-reviewed sources are. We'll even go into that a little more depth, but that's usually what's required at the graduate level. And then, oh, I missed one here. So for undergraduate level, quotations of sources, that's usually sufficient. Whereas usually at the graduate level, you want to move away from quoting, using the exact words of the source, and instead paraphrasing should be your focus. So we'll talk about that more in a moment as well. In addition, in terms of types of sources, secondary sources are often allowed. And I'll kind of give you some examples about what that means. We have primary sources, which are the original sources. And then a secondary source would be another article, book, something that's going back to that original source. And at the undergraduate level, it may have been okay to just kind of use the secondary source, but at the graduate level, you really want to go back to the primary. So I'll talk about that more in a moment. Usually at the undergraduate level, style guides are encouraged, but not necessarily enforced. And comparing that to the graduate level, primary sources are strongly encouraged. And usually a style guide like APA, depending on the discipline, is much more closely adhered to. So if you were to summarize, just from that little brief review, the differences between these two sets of expectations, how might you characterize that? You can type in the chat or you can unmute yourself and speak up. So how would you characterize those differences? Anyone like to summarize for us? So the main thing here is to think about when we talk about the differences between undergraduate and graduate, we really just have different standards that professors expect of your writing. And so we're just going to go into some of these factors a little more. Thank you, Nina. Yeah, exactly. So primary sources and more legitimate sources are required. Yeah, that's really great distinction. So really just thinking more deeply about your sourcing that you're using and how to incorporate it. And that's another great one, Rachel. So more independent. You're really expected to have more sophistication, more comfortability with working with research and incorporating that into your writing. And Josh says, graduate writing relies on primary sources and adherence to rules of style, where undergraduate writing can use secondary sources and style guides are only recommended. Great summary. Thank you, Josh. All right, so let's keep going and we'll kind of define some of these terms in case they're not all completely new, if any of them are new to you. So I'm going to focus on 4 things. There are other things we could talk about when we think about scholarly writing, but these are the 4 things that I think we can address today. One is the number of sources used in a paper or document. Another is the credibility of sources. Presentation of sources. So what I mean by that is paraphrasing versus quoting. And then primary versus secondary sources. So I want to just define some of those terms before moving on. As you know, you've been in the educational system for a while, and you know that examples of sources can really range from blogs and open source websites like Wikipedia to peer-reviewed journals. And somewhere in the middle would be popular or trade journals or magazines. So the credibility of a source is determined by a couple of different factors. One is that it's written by someone who is an expert in their discipline. It is free from errors and bias. And the credibility of a source can relate to how rigorous the editing process is, who the author is, and that is that person an expert in the field, and even where the information is published. So we're going to look at some examples of sources and talk about whether or not they are scholarly or more, of the popular or open source. And then when we discuss paraphrasing versus quoting, I'll just give you a couple of definitions here from APA and the benefits of paraphrasing. So APA says that a paraphrase restates another's idea or even your own previously published idea in your own words, whereas the quotation is using the exact words of the author with quotation marks. Both, of course, require correct citation. But one of the things I like about the APA manual is not only that it tells us all the do's and don'ts about formatting, but it also gives us a lot of great information on how to write at a scholarly level. And one of the things that it shares is that paraphrasing gives us many benefits as a writer because we can summarize, synthesize, and compare and contrast data. So we have, as the writer, we have more flexibility by paraphrasing and really engaging in the research as we're working with it. So in terms of some practical guidelines, usually paraphrasing, if you can do that all the time or almost all the time in your documents, that's great. If you do use a quotation, I've heard professors say they like no more than 5 words strung together. And so that's an interesting guideline to go by. I think it's a good idea because it's already forcing you to paraphrase somewhat. And then unless you have some sort of special research project, maybe with a dissertation, but typically block quotes are not, which would be 40 plus words, are generally not used at the master's level. It kind of depends on the project, but that's pretty typical. And then a couple of other terms here before we get into our practice. So this is the primary versus secondary info. According to APA, in scholarly work, a primary source reports original content. A secondary source refers to content first reported in another source. Okay, so the guidelines here, according to the manual, are utilize primary sources. Do not rely on others to read and paraphrase the work for you. Instead, find the primary source, read it, and cite it directly. If you find an article that a secondary author has cited, that's great. Now just kind of go through those other steps, find that article in the database and read it for yourself. That's kind of a good scholarly practice to adhere to. So these were the 4 things we're discussing so far: the number, credibility, presentation, and type of source. So we're going to first just look at some examples of the numbers of sources. When you are writing at the undergraduate level, typically fewer sources are required. So for example, when one spends excessive time on social media, they make the mistake of oversharing. This can include oversharing in various areas. So here's the topic, and there's one source used. Okay, so that's pretty typical. It is paraphrased, so that's good. But for a graduate writing, if you can, use 3 to 5 corroborating sources to support claims. So for example, here's a definition of life satisfaction according to subjective well-being. And there are 3 synthesized sources that all found the same information. And so they were synthesized together and paraphrased. So that's kind of a little difference there. Is what you might use one source at the undergraduate level. At the graduate level, really rely on trying to find multiple sources. In terms of credibility, we can, so let's say this is a paraphrase that's in an undergraduate paper. Social media can be detrimental to the mental health of users, okay? And then there's this in-text citation that looks good. But if we look at the reference for this, we see that this is the connection between social media, and here is the URL, talkspace.com/blog, etc. So it looks like this. This was a little screenshot from that. So is this a strongly credible source? Well, probably not, because it's from a blog. You can always read these kind of things to give you background information, but you probably wouldn't be using that in your paper. Whereas for graduate level writing, you would rely on peer-reviewed journals. So here's a paraphrase, and then here is this reference for this source, and you can immediately see, okay, it's coming from this journal. And it's very recent, and here's the screenshot of that. So we know this is a peer-reviewed article that was found, it's in the APA. Let's see, what was the journal? I think, psychological trauma. So we see this as a very scholarly source, and it's going to be better for, adding that strength to your writing. In terms of paraphrasing or quoting, this would probably be acceptable at either level, but you just want to make sure, undergraduate or graduate, oversharing on social media can lead to problems. And then here is a quotation. So try to paraphrase as much as possible at the graduate level. And you can do that by just really practicing that skill where you're rephrasing whole sentences, flipping the sentence around, and really working to understand large sections of an article and then put that in your own words. And then the last example I want to show you before we get to some practice is primary versus secondary sources. So here's an example of what would be a secondary source. And APA does give you an option for how to cite that. But you can see here is a quotation, and then it says, as cited in TAM 2022, paragraph 12. So note the secondary TAM refers to a primary source, Vellum, Pini, and Neoni. So that's how you would do it if you were including a secondary source. But better would be to go back to the original and really try to find those multiple sources that add credibility to your work. So I just want to pause there and see if anyone has any questions at this time before we keep moving on to our practice. Anything right now? Any ideas or responses you have, comments you want to make about experiences you've had with incorporating these types of factors in your writing?
I would just mention, Julie, speaking about paraphrasing, for those that may not know, last term we did have a webinar presentation on some helpful tips on paraphrasing, which can be a challenge. So that is actually on our webinar videos page. So I'll drop the link here. and it's under the Jumpstart Your Writing for Fall 2022 series. So if you click on that tab, you can see there were 3 presentations that were done. And so the second one there is on plagiarism, paraphrasing, and substantiation. So if any of you are interested, you can see a recording from last term, which has some helpful tips, because we know paraphrasing can be a challenge, right? So.
Thank you, Carlos. I was thinking about that when I was talking about it, and so I'm glad you shared that. Okay, well, let's keep moving, and we're going to get into breakout rooms in just a moment. Let me just make sure I'm sharing the right thing. Okay, so we're going to practice, and what we're going to do is look at these 4 elements that I told you about, and we kind of went through examples. And what we're going to do is use a handout that you can go into and view. And what I'd like you to do is look at this paragraph. That's a sample paragraph, and then evaluate it by these different factors: the number of sources used, the credibility, was it paraphrased or quoted, and primary versus secondary. So this is the paragraph you'll be looking at, but I'm going to share the handout. And you can all open this up. I'll put it in the, so here's the practice. So if you wouldn't mind going into that document that I just put in the chat, and then we'll go through, we'll take a few minutes in breakout rooms, and you all can discuss these different factors. And okay, Josh, thank you. You can just stay in the main room. And just discuss, or if you wanted to go into the room and just chat, Josh, that's okay too, but whatever you'd prefer. And so what you'll do with this handout is just go through the sentences, kind of read it together, and see if you can identify the 4 areas of number, credibility, presentation, primary versus secondary, and just how would you respond? How would you make this paragraph better? Okay, so that's kind of the, all right, Hester, thank you. That's kind of the task right now. So any questions before we do that? Okay, so Gina or Carlos, did you have those breakout rooms set up, ready to go?
Carlos, did you already set them up? Or I can do that right now if you'd like.
No, I didn't, but I can do that.
Okay, well, it looks like actually several people can't participate, so
Maybe we can just do it as a group if
we'll
you'd
just
like.
do it as a group.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay.
So let's see. We're in this document. Yeah. So how about I'll do this? I'll read through the sentences so everyone can kind of hear what this is going on in the paragraph. And in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just, we'll talk about these 4 elements and see, how you would improve this. So it says opioid use in the US is getting out of hand. It is leading to abuse, addiction, overdose, and death commonly associated with use of different substances. Many people, including children, die from OUD. Every aspect of society is impacted by opioid use, including family connections, public health and safety, as well as the health and well-being of the individual with OUD. Each year, so this is a quote, each year opioid overdose, misuse, and dependence account for $35 billion in healthcare costs, $14.8 billion in criminal justice costs, and $92 billion in lost productivity. That's from Pew Research. And the last sentence, in addition, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the total economic burden of prescription opioid misuse alone is approximately $78.5 billion a year, including healthcare costs, addiction treatment costs, and lost productivity. And that's as cited in GUPTA 2021. Okay, so this is the task, is looking at this paragraph. And if we were just to go through these elements, let me just paste them in the chat. Could you comment on one of these? Do we need more sources? So number 1, where would those go? What about the credibility of sources? And you can see those were, the references were shown on that document. Presentation of sources in primary versus secondary. So in the chat, or if you could unmute yourself, what would you look at? Okay, so Josh says, I think the first sentence needs a reference to a baseline from the past and compare it to current numbers. Okay, great. So that's definitely related to the number of sources and making sure that each claim has a source listed.
Sentence 3 maybe needs a source.
Yeah, let's take a look at that. So sentence 3, many people, including children, die from OUD. Yes, exactly, Nina. And then Gerke says, it feels like direct quotes are cited, but paraphrase data is lacking references. Okay, yeah, you're exactly right. So let's assume, put the best construction on it, that these first 4 sentences are paraphrased, but there are no citations. Yeah, you're right, exactly. So that's good. So if we're talking about the number of sources, we know that maybe those first 4 sentences need more. Just kind of as a side note, any comment about the tone of sentence number 1? This isn't really in what I talked about, but it says opioid use in the US is getting out of hand. What do you think of the tone of that sentence?
It doesn't sound scholarly, doesn't feel appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. So Josh says out of hand is very casual. It's too colloquial. Exactly. Yeah, and exactly. We're very generalized and incomplete. I totally agree. So this is I'll give you an example of a better framing of the same issue in the next slide. But you're definitely right. So the first sentence, maybe just throw out, right? And then get to adding more citations in the next couple. Okay. And so we've talked a little bit about number of sources. I want to point out one other thing. Let me just share the Google Doc instead. I want to make sure I'm looking at the right thing. Are you looking at the Google Doc? Okay, thanks, Carlos. So here are the references for these sources. The references for the ones, so there's Pew Research, and then the very last sentence has GUPTA 2021. So can anyone comment on this source? It says GUPTA, what we can do about the opioid crisis, from Forbes. So what do you think of that source? Yeah, good, Rachel. So it's a website, it's a popular magazine. I would say, I think it's a business magazine. And so it might be helpful for the writer to maybe read that just for background information, but it would not be considered scholarly. It's not peer reviewed and would probably not include original research. So this last sentence, so that's one issue, is that the citation, the source itself is not credible. It's not sufficient, not strongly credible, I would say. Is there any other issue you see with sentence 5 that you might?
Secondary source.
Yeah, exactly. So we see that as cited in, and then we know that it's a secondary source. And because it's the CDC, this would not be difficult to find. It's, the CDC information is not difficult to access. So it could be easily traced down to its original source. And then we talked a little bit about the quoting versus paraphrasing, but you can definitely see these are, like, if you were to turn this paragraph in to turn it in, the similarity score would probably be like 60% on original, right? Because there's 2 long quotes. And they're not really necessary to quote either. These are just statistics and numbers. It's so easy. it can be easier to paraphrase those types of things than other, sentences that have more maybe content that, is working with language, that kind of thing. But with numbers and figures like this, it's a little easier to paraphrase, and there's really no need to quote those. Okay, let me just show you a couple of other things. So on this document, I just went through, let me just move this over. I just went through the various things here and pointed out what the different aspects we were looking at. So let me find the first one. So there are two sources used in this original paragraph. And that may be sufficient for an undergraduate level, but at the graduate level, you could definitely add more here. In terms of credibility, there are two sources used, but the Forbes is a popular source. In terms of the presentation, these are both quoted and not paraphrased. And then,
Sorry, Julie, we're
can you
not
see
to
my
cut you
screen?
off. I see the blank. I see your background.
Oh, shoot. Okay, let me switch. Let me get that.
And just there was one question in the chat, but I'm not sure if I'm able to understand Bobby Salas's question. He says, would you say that courses in undergrad that dealt with neuroscience research benefits for grad students, considering the APA format used there, along with the use of peer-reviewed sources? So I'm not sure if he's might want to clarify there if you're asking the difference between undergrad research and graduate research. Not sure if I understand that question completely.
I could clarify that. Sorry about that. So I was asking more along the lines of like, because I know that there's obviously a difference between writing styles for undergrad and grad students. What I was trying to clarify was, do you think that, say you took a course in undergrad that was dealing with neuroscience and the class required you to make points, like say, find research articles that supported treatment for a certain psychological disorder that required an APA format and peer-reviewed sources, do you think courses such as that help for grad school because it has a similar approach, like, using peer-reviewed sources and the use of an APA format?
Gina, would you like to reply to that?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. It sounds like the professor had high standards and really wanted you to use peer-reviewed work. So absolutely, very good preparation. And it's not to say that all undergraduate professors don't want peer-reviewed work. It's just that there's probably less of a focus on that than there is in graduate school. But certainly many professors, I think in undergrad, may also ask for these kinds of sources and have this kind of rigor in their courses. And if they do, that's great, because then that really prepares you for grad school. So thank you for clarifying, Bobby.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bobby, thank you. So that was your experience in undergraduate? You had that one course and the professor was really rigorous with the standards?
I kind of had quite a few professors like that because I did my undergrad at the University of Oregon.
Mhm.
So my degree was in psychology. It was a bachelor's of science. So a lot of the courses as you got to the upper levels, they dealt more of they kind of emphasized that format more because
Mhm.
just the nature of the work we were doing. Whether it's, people tend to like pursue their master's or PhD after. So I think that's why they kind of heavily emphasize that towards the end of your undergrad.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, I've seen various standards, enforced, and like Gina said, it could really depend on the professor or the program or the course. But in general, these standards are definitely more rigorous at the graduate level, especially with these particular factors that I pointed out. There are other factors that, we could also look at, like the currency of sources, how new are the sources, how recent, and there are other things as well. But thank you for pointing that out, Bobby. I'm glad you had that experience. Would anyone else like to share their experience? Did they find that sort of difference in undergraduate to graduate writing or a different experience?
I can share a little bit.
Yeah, surely. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. So I don't know if it's just the major that I chose in my undergrad, but I studied marketing in my undergrad. And so we actually didn't have a lot of papers or anything to write. We did a few business plans or a few, group activities in understanding like the market and competitors and things. So I actually didn't have a lot of experience with writing. So I feel like I've been struggling a lot in my master's program because I'm learning this, it feels like, for the very first time. So I really appreciate the Writing Center for, having these times where we're able to gather to learn more, because I do feel a little insecure that I don't have the foundation that I should, going into my master's program. But I appreciate the support that you provide with these workshops. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. Thank you for sharing. That's really, really great information for us to know and to kind of understand that every student comes to graduate school with a varied background, right? And you may not have had a psychology degree if you're going into psychology, or, whatever. You may not have had that preparation, or like you're saying, you may not have been in a type of program that was writing heavy. So it might feel like kind of a new process to be going into this much depth with including research and writing a lot of assignments. So thank you so much for sharing that, Shirley. And I'm so glad you're here today and joining us for some learning. Any other comments or experiences you'd like to share from your educational experiences?
Could I add on to what the previous student was describing?
Yeah, Bobby, please.
Yes, so it's just more like a word of advice. So don't feel discouraged that like you didn't have that experience. Like obviously not everyone going to this program was a psychology major, but it's more just like a learning curve, I guess you can say. I mean, there's plenty of resources like YouTube. We live in this day of age of internet, so anyone can really learn it. Ask your professors. But I mean, that's kind of how I felt when I was an undergrad, switching to that format, and just showing that you want to learn and asking these questions, should help you a lot.
Thank you, Bobby. That's good advice. We all come from different backgrounds, and it's really terrific that you all are taking advantage of the different resources available, no matter what your level is, because I think we all can grow in our writing, and it just takes practice and kind of knowing some of these concepts and knowing what to look for. So thank you for sharing that, Bobby. And Nina says, oh yeah, interesting. My degree was in classics, so the standard for sources was different, especially if you're writing commentary on ancient texts. Yeah, so that's very specialized and may not apply as much to what is your program now, Nina? Are you in psychology or education?
Yes, psychology.
Okay, so yeah, so that gave you terrific background on different working with languages and really being able to utilize ancient information to kind of work on your new learning, but it may be pretty different than what you're experiencing today with all of the assignments. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it's great. And I see Tracy came from screenwriting. So that, again, very different experiences. Oh, and Tracy, I'm so glad. Carlos is awesome, of course. As is
Yeah,
Gina.
thank you, Tracy. I will just mention my experience in my undergrad, coming from as an English major. I was an English major in my undergrad. So we did learn like MLA, Modern Language Association style. So we were briefly introduced. I think one of the biggest differences in writing about literature as opposed to the graduate level, which was a big shift, learning APA. I think there is a lot more emphasis on adherence to APA style and formatting here at the graduate level. So there's much more consistency in the writing, I think, as opposed to undergrad. And also the tone where writing about literature, the style I tended to write a little bit more like prose, looking for more eloquence, a little bit more flowery language, maybe using metaphor more consistently and figurative language, things that maybe were a little bit more subjective as opposed to APA style here at the graduate level being much more objective and really looking at supporting the claims that you're making rather than the way that you're styling the argument, right? Looking for conciseness and brevity in a lot of the ways that we're expressing the ideas to maximize the meaning, as opposed to, for my experience at the undergrad level as an English major, maybe kind of making things a little bit more prose-like and a little bit flowery, maybe with using more emphasis on figurative language. So that was just, kind of the differences there, from my undergrad to graduate, much more objective based now and much more adherence to that style, that APA style formatting, and making sure that you're supporting your claims, right, with evidence.
That's great, Carlos. And Nina, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I was also an English major and I taught literature to a little bit, and I was teaching my students to do literary analysis. So that may have been what you're doing, Nina. And in that case, you are using text to support your interpretations, but it's just it is a very different approach. The APA manual talks about using straightforward, clear language, exactly like what Carlos is mentioning there. So thank you all for sharing your experiences. It helps to see there are a lot of different ways people come at, or what their background is and how that maybe informs what they're doing today, and maybe areas where we can grow as well. I want to just share one more thing, and then we have time for any other questions or anything you'd like to share. So what can you see right now on my screen? The paragraph? Okay.
Yeah,
good.
we can see the prompt. Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, the prompt. Okay, so
No, I'm sorry, the sample
sample
paragraph. There.
Okay,
Yes,
great.
that paragraph.
Okay, so I just want to move forward here. So this is the paragraph that I think would be more aligned with some of these concepts that we're talking about with graduate level writing. So I'll just kind of give this to you as an example of what could work. And we'll see how those different elements came out. So from 2002 to the present, non-medical prescription or illicit use of opioids as a public health issue in the US has risen to epidemic levels. So here, that other sentence was, it's getting out of hand. Well, now we have operational language. We've got 2 sources to support that fact. In fact, in the US, 2.7 million individuals report suffering from opioid use disorder. So here's that citation from the CDC as a primary source, and it's paraphrased. The effects of abuse, addiction, overdose, and death are commonly associated with OUD. Another primary research article, peer-reviewed article. Opioid involved overdose deaths have significant increases as well, rising from 46,000. And then we've got some numbers there. So that's the Institute on Drug Abuse. And you might look at the dates of these different sources all within about the last 5 years. Whoops. Oh, yeah. Even sentence 5, even more significant, is examining the increase in the 7-year period between 2015 and 2022. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, 47,000 opioid users in the US overdosed and died compared to 102,000 in 2022. This more than twofold increase shows how serious the problem of overdose deaths has become in the US. So we have all those different elements being exemplified here. Everything's paraphrased. There are, I think there was 6 or 7 sources in just this one paragraph. These are all primary sources and everything is paraphrased. So I think kind of veering toward or leaning into some of these different aspects of the writing can really help you to put your best foot forward in terms of adding that strength and credibility to your work. So we have a few minutes to wrap up here. Does anyone have any questions or concerns they'd like to share? Great, Nina. I'm glad you were able to join us.
I guess one of the things, I'm also not from the field of psychology. I have an MBA and, business writing is kind of what I'm more used to. But in terms of citing your sources, it felt strange to me when I wrote my first few APA papers to have a source after almost every sentence, but it sounds like that's okay, or it looks like that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, we can't make a claim without putting a source behind it, right? So you could see in that paragraph I just shared, there was a little bit of analysis in there where it was like analyzing, okay, here's the 7-year period. That was just that was just my own voice in there, but it was supported by the claim coming in the next sentence. You know what I mean? So when you're paraphrasing a text in one paragraph, you won't have to put the same citation at the end of every sentence, and that's often the case. But in a literature review, or I know one of the trauma classes in the online psychology program, they have a lot of research they have to pull into one of their papers. You might have a bunch of different sources in a single paragraph, and so yeah, I mean, you would probably be adding those citations at the end of almost every sentence. That's a great point, Gerke, and it's not incorrect. It's actually adding strength to your claims.
Thank you.
Anything else? Any other questions, thoughts?
I wanted to add something to this.
Yeah, go ahead, Bobby.
Yeah, so for the people who aren't used to the writing format, what I kind of noticed with my classes here, because I was used to doing that format in undergrad, but what I appreciated building that habit was when my professor was telling me about like one of her therapy sessions, and how when you use a treatment and it's like a treatment that is backed by peer review research. So like in a legal setting, say for example, right, they're like, why did you diagnose my patient with depression? And you're like, well, sir, like, ma'am, like, you explain the scale you use and why it's backed by, and then if it's a very popular one, they're gonna know it's backed by research. Then they'll just be like, all right, like you protected your stance basically. So and like that writing kind of like builds that habit, because if you need to do that one day, it'll be like second nature to you now versus like something new.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, Bobby. So in terms of actually working with clients who are dealing with psychological issues, and if you don't have an evidence-based background for why you are diagnosing this, well, then that's not good. So we want to be able to, at every point, be able to back up what we're saying with evidence. That's just being a good scientist. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Gina, would you like to? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Carlos.
I was just going to mention and build on Bobby's comment that it's actually going to help us be better communicators in general, right?
Mm.
When we're presenting ideas or having discussions with others, right? Understanding how some arguments that we make or some claims that we make, we would want to have some support for those claims, you know, in general, whether we're having a discussion with someone else or in an academic setting, right? Just understanding that, you know, understanding the purpose of remaining objective, right? And using support to, you know, for evidence as for any claim that we're making, right? That's just going to help us to be better communicators in general, on top of contributing to the class work that we're doing, you know, in our writing assignment. So that was a great point that Bobby mentioned there.
Yeah, great point. It's just a way to be a critical thinker and to really, you know, interact with community members, with colleagues, with everyone, to be able to, you know, really find our, you know, make claims that are evidence-based. So yeah, and Shirley, thank you for your comment. I find that I used to write children's books. I have written children's books in the past, and then I was a literature teacher, an English teacher. And I find that my voice, you know, when I'm doing sort of research writing, it's kind of just a different genre. So if you just think of it as a different genre that you can develop, you find the standards and, you know, which are related to some of these factors we discussed. Then I think you see how to kind of shift your writing to adjust to that sort of standard. Would you like to expand at all on that? And I know Gina responded, that's a great piece of advice, just practice is so helpful. Shirley, would you like to share anything else? If not,
Yeah,
it's okay.
you know, it's kind of like after I'm doing the research and I'm really thinking about what it is that I'm writing, I'm sometimes like, okay, did I think that, or did I read it? Was it somebody else's thoughts? Like, should I be, you know, quoting, or like, should I cite this? Like, you know, and it kind of becomes this things where it's like, I don't even know what my own thoughts are at times, because it's like I've been reading all this content and thinking about things and trying to process it, and then when you get down to writing, it's like, okay, is that an original thought? Did I already know this? Like, and then how do you express that in the writing to say, okay, this is my analysis of it based off of this and this, and it's just been a little difficult in trying to understand that flow and understand when it's okay to say your own thoughts. But I think you made a good point when you presented that last piece of writing where you had like an original thought and then your next sentence was that supporting sentence, and I didn't really think about how that can be done. So that's a great point that you just demonstrated that I'm going to take with me into my next paper, because I felt like in previous papers I just had some insecurity and just some anxiety about, like, I don't want to do this wrong and get in trouble. I want to make sure I'm citing. I want to make sure, you know, I'm not plagiarizing or anything like that. So yeah, but that was a good piece of information that I'm going to bring into my next writing assignment. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, you can say something like, let's say you have a paraphrase of a source. Well, the next sentence can be, it's not really your opinion so much as your interpretation or your analysis. So it could say, this shows that this research demonstrates that this is an important issue for blah, blah, blah. You know, so you're kind of analyzing it and explaining it to the reader. So you're still basing your analysis on research. And every time you're making those new claims, you must just back it up. So, and I've heard students say that too, you know, I knew this, I was taught this fact in, you know, my last class or something, do I have to cite it? And usually you can find some sort of support for it. And so it's good to always go back and try, the more specific we get with it, including claims in our work, you know, we should just cite them. So but I know what you mean. It's kind of a balance. Like, I want to make sure I'm not plagiarizing, but also, you know, what is kind of the reasonable standard. So thank you, Shirley, for sharing that. So Gerke, I did put the Google folder in there. Hopefully you can see those. Is that, yeah, okay, good. And I think I got the access right, so you should be able to get to it. Any other thoughts? I know Carlos and Gina maybe had some announcements they'd like to share, but anything else you'd like to bring up before we close today? Okay, well, we always invite you to return to writing support. Carlos, would you like to share about the upcoming presentations?
Yes, so we do have, this is part one of the 3-part series that we're having this term. So we do have a few other, I'll put the link to our events page where you can see a description of a couple of other events that we're having. And also, if you are interested, we will be using the same Zoom link for the next session. So if you are interested, there's a link to the events page. The next event is in February on, it's actually preparing students for dissertation clearance. So if you're interested in learning more about the doctoral program, the process, and finishing the dissertation, or if you are a doctoral student, you're welcome to join. And then the event in March is about presenting at a conference. So I believe we'll have some guest speakers to share some of their insights. So definitely encourage you to join and RSVP, and we'll be using the same Zoom link for those other sessions.
And I just want to jump in. The two presenters for presenting at your first conference are both alums from GSEP, one from the master's program in psychology, and then the other from both a master's in teaching and then her doctorate at GSEP. And both of them began presenting in the master's as master students. And I think it's really kind of helpful to know that you can get the word, you can start to become more visible in academics by presenting at conferences. And it's a great thing to start adding to your curriculum vitae. So just something to think about. And they will have some really interesting tips and advice to you for doing that. So I do hope you're able to make it.
Thank you, Gina and Carlos. Any other thoughts, Gina or Carlos, before we close?
Just if you have some suggestions about topics that you would like us to cover during these webinars that we haven't yet covered, please feel free to type in the chat, or you can even email us afterwards if you have some thoughts a little later. But we really are here for you. We want you to know that we will do whatever we can to support you and make sure that you feel more confident as a student in your writing. So, and then Julie has this exit ticket. And so we want to encourage you to fill that out. Let us know how we're doing and how we can best help you.
Thank you so much. Well, that's a great idea. Maybe walking through the digital library access. Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Gerke.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we do have, I don't know if those videos from Maria would work in that situation,
We
Gina.
do. Yes. Yes. In fact, let me just see. I recently, let me see if that's the one. I think maybe. Let's see. Try clicking on that link. I think that might be, yes, that's the library video actually.
Perfect.
So you might find that really helpful.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, it's depending on your specialty. There are some databases that are, a little more toward education or psychology, and you're always welcome to talk with a librarian or chat with a librarian if you're having any trouble. But that video kind of gives you the basics of how to get to the databases and search. But yeah, we'd be happy to help you with that as well. All right, well, we're going to wrap up here, and thank you so much for participating. If you wouldn't mind, please filling out that exit ticket before you leave. That will help us do better in the future. And And we just thank you for your engagement and your participation today.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you,
a
everyone.
great day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.